The number one question I see from people looking to get into retro gaming is which console they should start with first. The default answer to this question is pretty much always going to be just recommending whatever system you grew up with. Okay, so what do you need me for then? Well, with all things equal, there are a few systems that I recommend above all else. These three consoles are not only great for those looking to develop a newfound appreciation of retro games, but are consoles that I feel anybody who's already playing retro games would enjoy. In fact, I'd be surprised if anybody who's been playing retro games for a while hadn't played these consoles yet. And these three consoles would be the original Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo. Funny enough, these are three consoles that all had mini consoles made for them with games built in. That may be an easier, more simple option for some, but I'm going to talk about the viability of collecting the original hardware and cartridges for these consoles as well. The first console that I'd like to talk about is the original Nintendo. There's a handful of things that make this a pretty quintessential retro console. It's the first home console made by Nintendo, perhaps the most well-known video game company there is. I'd argue that most of its best games are just as playable now as they ever were, and some of the biggest video game franchises we've ever seen got their start on this system, or at least have some very heavy roots here. The Mega Man series, the Ninja Gaiden series, the Mario series, Zelda, Contra, Castlevania, Punch-Out, Final Fantasy, heck, even something like Metal Gear, where even though the real game only came to Japan, the brand name was still here, albeit a different game. I think this is important because most people looking to get into retro games will likely have played at least some more modern games. So, if they have that brand recognition, it could help to ease the transition from modern to retro. Not to mention, it could be incredibly fascinating and intriguing for somebody to see what the older games in one of their favorite franchises are like. For example, let's say somebody has only ever played the 3D Mario games and never played the 2D Mario games. It's hard to imagine, especially with the recent success of the Mario Maker series, but let's just say somebody really familiar with the Mario series has never played one of the older 2D Mario games. Classic, side-scrolling Mario with level and game design crafted by some of Nintendo's absolute best creative minds. Don't you think that could be an absolutely mind-blowing experience? Heck, the game blows people's minds who are already big fans of 2D Mario games. Now, we do need to talk about the feasibility of playing on the original hardware. A lot of these original NES consoles are going to need to have their pin connectors either replaced or tightened up. That alone might be reason enough for somebody to forego the process and just pick up the mini version. However, if you still want original hardware that you can plug cartridges into, you can always get the top loader model of the console, which, as the name would describe, and believe it or not, loads cartridges from the top. Also, it should be pointed out that cartridges for this system are generally affordable, especially some of the more popular, common games. Okay, next console would be the Sega Genesis. A lot of my reasons are actually kind of similar to my reasons for the NES. So we have Sega, one of the most well-known video game companies that's ever been around, and this is by far their most successful console. Sorry, Dreamcast. Not to mention, this is where Sonic got famous and almost single-handedly built his legacy. With how many bad Sonic games have come out over the years, some people have wondered why so many people like him in the first place. It could be a really cool experience to get to play some of his best games and see what all the buzz is about. There's one key difference with the Genesis over the original Nintendo though. A lot of the best games on this console exist in franchises that are no longer around anymore, certainly not like they used to be. That definitely sucks in and of itself, but I think in a strange way this can be a plus for gamers because they could find something totally new they've never heard of before and have some really satisfying fresh experiences. The thing with the Genesis is that a lot of its best games aren't super well known. Even back in the day, a lot of its best games sort of went under the radar. I mean, those of you who have been watching this channel for a while know how much I like to go on and on about how great Rocket Knight Adventures is. The prices on some of the original cartridges may be going up a bit, but at least the hardware is pretty widely available. There were a few different models, but in general, it's agreed upon that the Model 1 is the best version to get, and specifically the one that ironically says high definition graphics on the top of it. Alright, last console on this list is the Super Nintendo. This is an easy one for me to suggest because, well, I don't know if I've ever actually mentioned this before or not, but I think it's the greatest console ever made, with the added benefit of all its games being just as playable now as they ever were. Well, except for maybe one or two, but the idea is that its games have aged extremely well. This console existed during the height of 2D games, and some of the best ones you could ever play are to be found here. Like with the original Nintendo, a lot of the really popular video game franchises that people know and love today are represented well on this system, while there are also some other games whose series I would argue reached their peak on this console before they took a downward turn heading into the 3D era that followed it. Plus, this console has great variety, with the only real weak spot people point to being shooters, and even then there's still some awesome standout titles like R-Type 3, which is excellent. There's short pick up and play type games, but then there's also plenty of games that will take you on adventures that you can really get engrossed in. Unfortunately, I do need to mention that the game cartridges for this console can be expensive, and even though I personally think they're worth it, it may not be for everybody. Okay, so that does it for the consoles that I would recommend, but of course picking a console can be a very personal thing. So if there's a certain system that really piques your interest, there's no wrong answers when it comes to this sort of thing. For this video's question, I'd like to ask a lot of you who are already well into retro gaming, which consoles you would recommend for somebody starting. Do you agree with my list, or would you suggest something different instead? I'd be curious to know what you say and why you have the answers you do if so. Alright, so be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.